So perhaps the biggest feature of the election results, never mind the coalitions, is the sheer amount of support that the ANC lost. It fell from over 57% in 2019 to just over 40% now. But this is part of a long-term trend. In 2004, 20 years ago, it won nearly 70% of the vote. It is just over half that now. Professor Christopher Isike is a professor of African politics and international relations at the University of Pretoria. Professor Isike, good evening, and thank you very much indeed for your time. So, the ANC is not the only party in a democracy that's been dominant for a long time and then loses a significant portion of that power. Are there similarities with how big parties like this lose power?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, for having me. The ANC is not the only dominant party that has actually lost, its ability to govern. There are several parties all over the world, across different continents, that have suffered the same fate, from Mexico to South Korea to Nigeria. The trend has been the same. You can also look at, even within Africa, you can talk about in Zambia, this has happened. So it's not. But studies show that there are several factors that account for why this is usually the case, and they're varied, but you can talk about, opposition coordination, the fact that opposition over time becomes more coordinated instead of fragmented. Then, institutional reforms that can then lead to how governance is done, and especially how elections are conducted. So we're talking about electoral reforms, like in the case of Nigeria, the introduction of, technology helped to reduce the incidence of vote rigging that putted the ruling party out of power. There's also a high level of corruption that affects the delivery of services, to citizens. And this in themselves lead to disenchantment with the ruling party. And this is what we've seen in the case of South Africa, for example. But the one big factor that really contributes to why dominant parties lose power is, factional conflict or factionalism within the dominant party, that then leads to breakaway parties taking a huge chunk of the vote, as we've seen in the case of South Africa.
So, this is the obvious point. If Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma were still members of the ANC, the ANC might well have over 60% of the vote.
Absolutely. It's clear.
Nothing lasts forever. Is that the case in democratic politics? No one party can just win election after election. I can't think of any examples of where, I can think of very few examples where one party stayed with more than 50% of the vote after 30 years. It does happen, but it's very rare.
It's rare, but we have a good case in Africa. It's in Tanzania. Although the party changed its name when it allowed multi-party elections in the country in 1995. However, it was the same party essentially. It's just like the ANC changing its name one way or another to CNA. That's what the CCMA party did in Tanzania, and they've been in power since independence till date as we speak. What did they do differently? They embraced change before it came. Of course, Julius Nyerere was very influential in ensuring that the party democratized internally and ensured that it took the opportunity to ride on the wave of democratization that was blowing in the continent, instead of living in fool's paradise and pretending that no change was coming. It instead was smart enough to decide to embrace that change and control that wave, rather than allowing the wave to control it. And that's why the CCMA party in Tanzania is one of the few dominant parties in the world that have held on to power for more than 50 years.
Is it almost, if you are running a big party like the ANC, and South Africa, lots of different countries have lots of diversity in them. I sometimes think South Africa maybe has more diversity than in other countries. But if you look at it, it seemed almost inevitable that someone like Jacob Zuma or someone like Julius Malema would eventually leave the ANC. Is there anything you can do to stop that from happening? And I know each story was its own story. The Julius Malema story was different to the Jacob Zuma story. But when you have leaders at that level, looking back, it seemed almost inevitable that this was what was going to happen in the ANC, that it would split. And in fact, there were predictions long before 1990 even that most political parties would come out of the ANC over time?
Yeah, you're right that there are nuances in each case. In the case of South Africa, it was inevitable at some point that this would happen, but it didn't happen when in 2007 when President Mbeki lost the elections to the party leadership election to Zuma, and you had the coup breaking away from that. So it was a question of how big the leader of the breakaway party is. And this is another factor in why dominant parties lose power, the rise of charismatic leaders that are able to convince the populace that they are a better deal than the ruling party. So I guess that's what happened with coup. In this instance, however, Jacob Zuma is a charismatic leader, a big gun, and you would think, look back now and wonder whether the allure or arrogance of power did not affect the ANC in how it dealt with the Zuma issue and in allowing his party to eventually derail it, as we've just seen in the recent polls.
Is there any regional dimension to this? I mean, I can't think that there is, but when I look at this issue, I'm struck by how, if you look at Southern Africa, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana may be a different example, but Zimbabwe, Mozambique, all governed by the political party which came from the liberation movement. Lesotho is very different. But all of those countries are still governed by a liberation movement. I mean, is there anything in that? I mean, if the ANC lost power completely, would that impact the other countries? I mean, it shouldn't, but I wonder if there's a regional aspect to it.
Well, it shouldn't. And these other parties have started having challenges long before the ANC had serious challenges that threatened its standing in terms of electoral outcomes. So the one thing that binds all of these together is the fact that these are states that were settler colonies compared to other states where colonialists did not really settle down or settle in those countries and left, at independence and allowed these countries to tread different political paths. In Southern Africa, the settlers remained and, if you like, instituted a significant control of civil society that was also useful in opposing government, but also ensuring stability. So, but the one factor that is common across all these parties in terms of the challenges that they are all having, including the ANC, that the ANC had, is the failure of these liberation parties to democratize internally, the failure to understand that the metrics, the strategies that worked for the struggle for freedom are different from the challenges of development which plagued these countries after freedom, and eventually that's what leads to to their downfall, because you have a new generation of citizens who did not experience the liberation struggles and will begin to ask questions around good governance, service delivery, and why they must continue to harp on, liberation credentials instead of, factual economics or standard of living or gross national product that actually affect their everyday existence.
When a party loses power, when a once dominant party loses power, does it ever get it back? I mean, I imagine some do and some don't. But when a party actually goes out of government, does it ever come back?
Well, it hardly. There's not many cases in history where parties that lost power eventually came back, and not likely. But maybe we'll see an interesting case in settler colonies, liberation parties, like you mentioned earlier in Southern Africa. There's a chance that the ANC could do that, depending on how the MK party manages itself. We started seeing a decline in the EFF, who everyone thought was the new bride in town, and then also how the ANC manages the coalition government, who they go into coalition with, and how well governed the country would be in the next 4 years would determine why it will come back. So, for example, if the ANC goes into a coalition with the DA and there is good governance, things improve generally for everyone, there's a chance that the ANC could take credit for all of that. And I dare say that the ANC has lost power as a governing party but it's still a dominant party because nothing in the country can happen without the say-so or buy-in of the ANC. So to that extent, they are still dominant. And depending on who they go into a coalition with, if things work out for the country in the next 4 years, the ANC could well claim credit for that and could be on the pathway to regaining power.
Professor Christopher Isike, thank you. Professor of African Politics and International Relations at the University of Pretoria.